is actually not mentioned just about anywhere. It's a minhag that apparently it's a minhag that goes way back because, as I've mentioned many times, that one of the indications of how back in the Jewish history a minhag goes can pretty much be you could actually ascertain based by how widely spread the minhag is. So Pesach is coming up, and we know that there's a minhag to not eat kitnius on Pesach, but that minhag has to be more recent because the Sfardim do not have that minhag. On the other hand, take for example the minhag of a yarmulke. That's a minhag that apparently goes way back. I mean, you could argue that it goes all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu, because I don't think there's anybody that could imagine Moshe Rabbeinu walking around without a yarmulke. So, but of course, I mean that's a joke. But the fact that yarmulke is a minhag that you find across the board, Ashkenazim, Sfardim, Teimanim, wherever Jews are found, the minhag is there, which is an indication that this minhag is goes way, way back before there was even such a division amongst Bnei Yisrael based on the, where on the globe they happen to settle. And then what happened after is that different minhagim, developed in the different places and were therefore not necessarily applicable to everybody. Anyway, the minhag of Tainis Esther, of course, is a minhag that's the Chol Tfutzos Yisrael. It's a minhag that's everywhere. But yet at the same time, and like I started to say, we use the same, the nusach is pretty much the same. And when you're saying the shlichus, the words, if you pay attention to them, will put you in the same mood as the shlichus that you say on Tzem Gedalia, Sarah B'Tevis, Shavasa B'Tamus. But at the same time, it's not quite the same. Tainis Esther is not the same. We are not commemorating any destruction, chas v'shalom. There's mention of the unfortunate situation, of course, in the times of Haman, but that's something that actually turned out to be favorable for us, which is why we have the Yom Tov of Purim. So Tainis Esther is a different kind, at least as far as the attitude, as far as the mood, it's a different kind of a fast. You already could sense and feel the Simcha of Purim. And this year, because it's more than just the day before Purim, it's actually 3 days before Purim, because it's pushed off because of Shabbos. And once you're pushing it off, you don't want to push it off to a Friday, which is Erev Shabbos. So therefore, the minhag is to fast on Thursday. But what it accomplishes in a year such as this year is that you actually begin Purim 3 days earlier, like Rabbi Yitkin was mentioning. Anyway, so that's just, yeah. So like I said, Muncie yesterday was full blown Purim mode. Okay, and the music is blaring, in the malls, and that was whatever. It's just an interesting observation. Okay, so Mitzvah Hashem today, we're going to give the long-awaited and promised shiur on Purim. Because the shiur has been devoted primarily to the Maimarim of the Alter Rebbe and Torah Or and Likutei Torah, we are actually going to lean on the Alter Rebbe to help explain the Yom Tov of Purim. So much so that I've said in the past and repeated many times that Chassidus, we know, adds a whole new dimension. You could say it adds a new chayas, a new life to Torah and mitzvahs. Purim, I claim, through the eyes of Chassidus, actually ends up being transformed into a different Yom Tov. It's a completely different Yom Tov. Well, I mean, I'm saying this is my observation, but I'm very convinced of that. The There are many different starting points where you could start a shiur, a discussion about Purim. There are quite a few different starting points. And the truth is that any one of them could be the stepping stone, the springboard towards a discussion of Purim. So before we get to the end, let me just say at the very beginning, let me just tell you what's going to be established according to Chassidus. What's going to be established is that Purim is a Yom Tov that we celebrate the essence of the Jew. Okay? When we speak about the essence of the Jew, we mean that core, quintessential essence of the neshama of a Yid, which is one with Hashem. One with Hashem means that it cannot be separated. It's cannot be separated, no matter what. Last week, I told a story about the reporter who had said some very harsh words about a Jewish individual who on the surface seemed to be deserving of his harsh words. And the Rebbe's comment to him was, "Is nicht ret ben wegen a Yid." This is not the way to speak about a Yid. Go back to the recording of last week's shiur for the story. But in any case, bottom line, I'm starting with the end, that Purim is a celebration of the inseparable bond, the core essence of the Yiddish neshama. That's what we are celebrating on Purim. Okay? So now let me make the case. So like I said, there are a number of things about in the sources of as far as Purim is concerned, by the way, we have a whole Masechta, we have a whole tractate in the Shas, in the Gemara, that's dedicated to the halachos of Purim. It's called Masechta Megillah. There actually is not a Masechta Chanukah. So these are two Yom Tovim that we observe that were instituted by a Sanhedrin, by the Chachamim. There is not a Masechta for Chanukah. So because I bring that up, and it's a very interesting topic, I'm going a little bit off on a tangent here, but it's a very interesting topic. There are a number of different explanations. One of the explanations is, first of all, that the story of Purim happened in between the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash and the rebuilding of the second Beis HaMikdash. The era of Torah study, let's say, from which the Talmud was formulated, began during the times of the second Beis HaMikdash. So Megillah was already established as a Yom Tif. It already had its halachas, right? So when Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi wrote down the halacha in the Mishnah, which is the beginning of the Talmudic era, let's say, right? The very first work of the Talmud, the basis of the whole Talmud, he also included a section, a Masechta as it's called, but the halachas of Purim, it's called Megillah. So it begins with the mitzvah of Megillah. Chanukah happened a few hundred years later. And in a way, Chanukah happened almost simultaneously with this beginning of the Talmudic era. Now, true, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wrote the Mishnah, lived, a few hundred years after the story of Chanukah. He actually, the establishing the Mishnah took place after the Churban of the second Beis HaMikdash. I guess approximately 150 years, and that's when Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi wrote down the Mishnah. But the development of the Mishnah, right? The evolution of the Mishnah, which we traditionally say this was the era of the Tanoim. The Tanoim actually already lived during the times of the second Beis HaMikdash. Okay, so but Rabbi Yehuda Nasi writes down the Mishnah, and it's quite a few hundred years after the story of Chanukah. The halachas of Chanukah were already established, right? Because they were incorporated into halacha by the Beis Din of the time, right? The Chachamim of the time, and it was accepted, and it became, like part of Shulchan Aruch. And yet we don't have a Masechta. So I heard very interestingly that it's actually based on the Ramban. With the Ramban says that he says one of the reasons is because even though the story of Hanukkah was miraculous, and even though the Maccabees and the different members of the Hanukkah story were great tzaddikim, says the Ramban, but nonetheless, it didn't last for too many generations. I mean, shortly after the time of the victory of Hanukkah, things went a little sour. Okay, and there was corruption and so on and so forth. Not only that, one of the things that the Ramban points out as being a mistake was that the Chashbonoim, they took over the Melucha, the kingdom, or the kingship, right? And this seemed to be somewhat in conflict with something we find in the Torah, in Tanakh, where Hashem promises to David HaMelech that the kingdom will always remain in his family. Okay? The Chashmonaim were Koyanim. So it was natural for them to have assumed that position, right? Because the Koyanim were the ones who actually maintained some kind of a status. We didn't have at that time a peoplehood or whatever, an element within Am Yisrael that claimed to be, of the rightful heirs to the Melucha of David HaMelech. So it was a mistake that, you can understand why it happened. But at the same time, it was against something that we find explicitly in Tanakh, right? So the Chashmonaim were from the Arkayan, right? Says the Ramban, but because they did not have a right, that's why it actually ended up within a generation or two becoming very corrupt, and it didn't actually have an actual kiyum. It didn't last. Okay. Now, I don't know if the Ramban says this, or I once heard somebody speaking about this, and he mentioned it. It could be it's in the Ramban that I'm quoting, and that is that you remember Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi was a descendant of David HaMelech, right? So some say that Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi was the one who felt that he has to defend the honor of the family of David HaMelech. So therefore, the Chanukah is mentioned in the Mishnah. It's mentioned, and it's actually mentioned almost like it's kind of like not as being the focus of the Mishnah. It's a halacha that has to do with if somebody's hay on the back of a camel or a donkey gets ignited by a Hanukkah menorah, right? That the store owner put at the front of the store. And therefore, when this fellow passed by with the hay, whatever, it caught on fire. Okay, so what's the liability over there? And it's only because the Mishnah happens to mention the Chanukah licht, right? So therefore, the Gemara, who elaborates on the Mishnah, asks, okay, what is this Chanukah that the Mishnah is talking about? And that's where we have the whole story. This was only in the Talmud afterwards, where we have the whole elaboration and the source of the halachas for Chanukah, the record of the halachas of Chanukah in the Talmud. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanossi, being a descendant of David HaMelech, felt that it wouldn't be proper to honor the Chashbonoim, who are the main characters of the story of Chanukah, with a mesechta of their own. Okay, this is, again, I'm not really sure if the Ramban says that, but I did hear that idea. Okay. We do have a mesechta Megillah, though. And it's basically dedicated to the laws of Purim. And there, where the Gemara, the Talmud, is discussing the mitzvah of Mishleach Manos and the mitzvah of Suda Purim, we find a very interesting halacha. It's one line in the Gemara, it's a quote from Rabbi. Now, Rabbi was not a Tana. Rabbi was an Amoira, so he was in the era after the closing of the Mishnah, right? So they don't have quite the same degree of authority as the Tanoim have. Yet, if they say something which is a tradition that they had, right, that they had learned from their teachers, in spite of the fact that it's not mentioned in a Mishnah, if it's a standing statement that's not challenged, it becomes halach. So what did Rabbi say? Amar Rabbi, Chayiv Adam Lipsume Bepuria. The Suda of Purim has to be a joyous occasion, and it has to be joyous to what degree? And he says the halacha, and halacha has to be very specific, right? Like to the zach, as they say, you have to drink until the point that you no longer recognize between Baruch Mordechai and Arur Haman. Blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. Like I say, it's one line, it's a statement. Omar Rabbo, Chayiv Adam Lepsumi Bepuria Ad Yoda Bein Arur Haman LeBaruch Mordechai. Finished. No challenge, nothing. And indeed, it becomes halacha. So you look in the Rambam brings it down as the halacha Purim. After the Rambam, you have the Torah, and after the Torah, you have the Shulchan Aruch. Wherever you're going to look in halachas of Purim, this is the established halacha. It stands unchallenged. Now, I will tell you that there is a lone opinion of the one of the Tanoim, that actually holds that this is not a standing halacha. How did he come to that conclusion? Because the Gemara goes on to say a very strange story. So before I even tell you the story, the bottom line is that this lone opinion in the amongst the Amirayim never actually became the halacha, right? So the Rambam brings it to halacha. Now you could say Rambam was also just a Rishon, right? But then what happened after the Rambam? The Torah adopts it as the halacha. Now the Torah was not a lone opinion. The Torah was trying to come to some kind of a consensus, and even more so, the Beis Yosef, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, he totally wrote it based on the process of consensus, right? So the consensus is that basically all of the Rishonim, no one challenges this the Gemara, only one. And just one opinion is not enough to change this having become adopted as the halacha. So for us, we open a Shulchan Aruch, and that's what the halacha says. Strange halacha, very strange halacha. But then the Gemara goes on to tell a story, which is in a way kind of even stranger, because this is what the Gemara does. The Gemara will bring a halacha, and then the Gemara will then tell a story that relates to that halacha. Okay, what's the story? The story is that there were two Amirayim, Rabba and Rabbi Zera, and and they were having their Purim Suda together. And then the Gemara says that they did this halacha, which, by the way, the fact that the Gemara brings a story relative to the halacha and that it was actually, they on record that there were Amirayim who actually followed this halacha, actually is kind of like one of the processes that are used to determine a halacha. So most of the Rishonim say, not only did Rabbah say something and it's unchallenged, the Gemara even comes and shows you how it was actually being manifested. It was actually happening. This halacha was being followed. By who? By none other than Rabbi Zera, right? And therefore, ipsum, they became shikar. They drank wine. They followed the halacha. They drank a lot of wine. What happened? Come, Rabba got up in the middle of the Suda. The Shochet Rabbi Zera, and he shechted Rabbi Zera. He shechted him. Finished. That's what the Gemara says. Okay. It was a real Levitic upbringing. It was so Levitic that Rabbi Zera got shechted. Okay. Well, nothing happened until the next day, right? And when Rabbi realized what happened, so it says, Boy Rachmei, he davened to Hashem, right? And he did a miracle. He did Chiyas Tamesa. Okay. This one lone Amira, this Tana, so I think mentioned in the Ran, I think, he uses actually the story to the opposite. He says, the reason the Gemara brings the story is to say that in spite of the fact that Rabbah just mentioned the halacha, but if you look at the story, you'll see that the Gemara is kind of telling you, look what could happen if you follow this halacha, and therefore perhaps it should not be adopted as the halacha. But like I said, he's a lone opinion. Okay? The Gemara then goes on to tell you something that even stranger happened, because the next year, Rabbah and Abzera, before Purim, they meet each other. And what does Rabbah do? Rabbah invites Abzera to come to his Purim Suda again, right? Invites him to his Purim Suda. I think this Purim, so the Rabbi Zera, what would you think Rabbi Zera would say? Are you kidding? Are you kidding? Look what you did last year. So I guess the Rabbi says, yeah, but I did Chesam Esim, the next morning. So right. So Rabbi Zera says, "Lav b'kol shaita v'shaita is sarachish nisa." You can't rely on miracles. So last year, Baruch Hashem, you were able to do Chesam Esim. You were brought me back to life, but I can't rely on that, right? Which is kind of strange. You would think that Rabbi Zera, that would be the end of the conversation. Are you kidding, right? I'm going to do subject myself again to you shechting me because you had too much to drink. But that's not what Rabbi Zera said. Rabbi Zera said, "I'd love to come to your suda. That would be great, and I would love that you should become shikah. To drink a lot of wine and shech me. Right? My only problem is that I don't know whether I'm allowed to subject myself because you cannot. There's a halacha that you're not allowed to rely on a miracle. Basically, it seems that something totally different happened, and it was a positive experience." Rab Zera would have liked to have that experience again, but he was kept back from having that experience because of the halacha that you cannot rely on a miracle that the Rabbi will be able to do Tchias Amesim once again. So we have a strange halacha, and we have perhaps even stranger story. I want to go back to the halacha because what's strange about the halacha is not that it doesn't seem like I don't know. It's out of character that the Gemara should tell us that this is how Jews should celebrate, right? The psumi. And it gets even a little more complicated because we're not talking just about drinking some wine and getting into a good mood, right? We're talking about drinking wine to the point that what do? You do something that seems so fundamentally absolute, and you're not able to recognize the difference between good and evil. Mordechai represents good, Haman represents evil, right? And it's so out of character to celebrate by such an extreme level of drinking, and then you tell me it should be so extreme that you're going to totally, lose sight of the distinction between good and bad, what's good and what's evil. Okay. So, okay. How do we make sense of all of this? I'm going to go to something else. Like I said, there's so many different things about Purim, right? We have also, Chazal tell us something interesting based on a pasuk in Megillah. Kimu v'kiblu masha hichelu kvar. They accepted, and it became the tradition. It became the halacha, right, for generations. But then the pasuk says in the Megillah, masha kimu kvar, masha hichelu, what they had already begun. So the Gemara discusses, or maybe it's a medrash, that what is this a reference to? What do you mean they had already started? So the Gemara says something interesting. He says, when the Yidden were standing at Har Sinai, and the pasuk uses the term that they were standing tachti sahar. So in Pshutei Shel Mikra, tachti sahar means that they're standing at the bottom of the mountain. Okay, that's what we all envision, is that they were standing at the bottom of the mountain. Comes along a medrash, and the medrash says, tachtis has a deeper meaning, has another meaning. It actually means that they were underneath the mountain. What do you mean underneath the mountain? So it says Hashem picked up the mountain, chigigis, like a canopy, right? And they were underneath the mountain. And then what happened? Hashem said, fine. If you're going to accept the Torah, wonderful, that would be great. But if not, poi tehei furaschem. This is going to be where you're going to be buried. Boom, the mountain comes right down on your head. Now, before you get excited, I do have to point out that this is a medrash. And a medrash, you don't have to take literally, okay? The medrash is coming to make a point, but you don't have to take it literally, right? But nonetheless, there's a point. The point is they were kind of forced into this situation where they immediately responded, Na'asa v'nishma, we'll do, we'll accept, we got it, right? So says the Medrash, Kan midor Rabba le'iraisa. If they were underneath the mountain and they were threatened that this is going to be the place of your burial, right? So then there's a big asterisk on this thing that we make such a big deal about. The Yidden had such an absolute acceptance of the Torah. We will just do it. Well, later we'll figure out what it means. But we are committed. It's an absolute committal. So well, 1 second. Who wouldn't commit with a mountain hanging over your head, right? So here comes Chassidus. Chassidus explains what this Chazal are saying. And again, Medrash does not have to be there. So when the Medrash says that the mountain was hanging over the head, wait, let me just finish. What the Medrash says is that there's an asterisk, but it wasn't only until the story of Purim that finally the question, the looming question that hanging over how genuine the Nasa B'Nishma was, right, at the time of the receiving of the Torah, has finally been put to rest. Look what they did at Purim. And at Purim, they accepted, they went with Mordechai, in spite of the decree of annihilation, which was still standing, of Haman, right? So that was the absolute expression of Na'asa v'Nishma. So for 1,000, about more than 1,000 years, there was an asterisk, so to speak. There was a question looming over this Na'asa v'Nishma, and it has only been confirmed with the story of Purim. Okay. So back to the idea of a mountain having the heads. Chassidus explains it's a medrash. What is the point the medrash wants to say? The point is that the Yidden had just experienced the miracle of Yetzias Mitzrayim and the splitting of the Yamsuf and all the amazing things that happened, leading up until Matan Torah 40 days later, right? 49 days later. And then the most unimaginable thing happened right before their eyes, right? Hashem comes down to Har Sinai. It was such a fantastic moment that all of reality flipped. And this is indicated where the Pasuk tells us that they saw the sounds, right? And they heard the fire and the lightning. What does that mean? What the Pasuk is telling us, and this is mentioned in the Gemara, Royim es hanishba and Shoimim es hanira. There was such a transformation of reality that which you normally hear, they saw, and that which you normally see, they heard. Right? So I'm not going to get into elaboration of what that exactly means, but there was definitely an experience, it was a life-changing experience. Okay? Everything that led up to Matan Torah, and then the event of Matan Torah itself. It was an awesome experience, right? An overwhelming experience. It was so overwhelming that when the Yidden say Na'asa v'Nishma, we can question, would you say Na'asa v'Nishma if not for what you are experiencing now? We don't know. Hasn't been tested. Says the Medrash, Purim happened. There were no miracles at the time. The miracles didn't happen until later. And yet, and not only that, just to get a little bit of an understanding of the psychological state that the Yidden were in, they had just experienced the Churban. They were hanging on to the very last hope that after 70 years, they're going to return to Eretz Yisrael and the Beis HaMikdash will be rebuilt, right? And then it turns out that that's not happening, right? And then you had Achashverosh, manipulating the situation. He just took advantage of that, right? And so for 70 years, he was patient and he waited before he defiled the Kelim of the Beis HaMikdash. Now the Yidden see him defiling the Kelim of the Beis HaMikdash, right? And making a party with tray food and tray wine, right? I mean, this is devastating, psychologically devastating. You're in the dark of dark. The Beis Hamikdash is destroyed. And now the Kalim, of the Beis Hamikdash, Azor, HaKorev Yumas, about which for 1,000 years nobody would dare go near the Kalim of the Beis Hamikdash, because the pasuk says that one who defiles the Kalim, he's worthy of death. So it was held in very, very high esteem, right? People would tremble before, doing anything with the vessels of it. And here comes Achashverosh, and he's literally defiling them, and nothing happens. Can you imagine the psychological devastation that the Yidden were experiencing at the time? And it's interesting, there's a Yalkut Be'amloyes, where the Yalkut Be'amloyes actually writes that Haman had issued a public letter to Am Yisrael. And the way the Yalkut Be'amloyes, I don't know if it's a real letter, or he kind of like, maybe he created this letter to make the point. But the point is that Haman was basically, he wrote this letter to Bnei Yisrael, and he used a very manipulative psychological approach. He said, listen, you guys were at the top of the world. We all looked up to you, right? We would send our kabbanas, we would send sacrifices, to your Beis Hamikdash. But then you guys messed up big time. You messed up big time, right? And it's your own fault. And therefore the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. Lest you think that God forgave you, well, here you have the proof. 70 years have passed. The last nevuah that you heard was that in 70 years you'll return. There was a miscalculation, but they didn't know that. They didn't realize that. And Haman says, okay, it's over. It's over. But you know what? We're nice. We're going to accept you into our society. We're going to accept you. So come. And you know what? It actually happened. What lured the Yidden to go to this Suda? Because they gave up. They totally gave up. So just given that whole background, right? And the state of mind that the Bnei Yisrael were in at the time, we're talking about a choshech kafel u'mechuppah. We're talking about the dark of dark. And also, it's good to bear in mind that this dark of dark, by the way, was also, there was this element of guilt, because they knew that they were at fault. They knew that they deserved for the Beis Hamikdash to be destroyed. So knowing that, that they were at fault, you can imagine that just magnifies that whole, psychological state. So it's a dark of dark. It's the darkest era. And also don't forget, this is the very, very first time that the Yidden are experiencing a Golus. This is the first Golus. After Golus Mitzrayim, there were 1,000 years of the living in Eretz Yisrael with Beis Hamikdash, with Nevi'im, with Melachim, right? Great times. And now they're in exile. Very first, like, we're pros at Golus. Okay, we've been living through Golus for thousands of years, right? So we're kind of like, we're already, we're somewhat, hardened. But first time of Golus. All of that. Imagine that in spite of it, the Yidden said, we're going with Mordechai. Na'aseh v'nishma. And here the Alter Rebbe says something that's actually a chiddush. The Alter Rebbe says that okay, so the story of Purim was that Haman convinced Achashverosh that to give out the decree, basically decreeing that the annihilation of the Jewish people. Okay, this happened before Pesach. Then we have Mordechai telling Esther to go appeal to the Achashverosh, and that was really the beginning of the story. I mean, technically, the beginning of the story was, it says, but the actual, miracles that happened, it was that on the second day of Pesach, I think it was, at the second Suda, Haman actually they hanged Haman. So that's the story. But so already we're seeing some light. But at the same time, though, the decree of annihilation was not removed. So here you have Am Yisrael, and the Alter Rebbe says they actually had the option of just giving up the Yiddishkeit, relinquishing their citizenship, giving it up, and they would have been saved. Interesting point. I think the Alter Rebbe is one of the only ones who makes that point. And yet, in spite of that, says the Alter Rebbe, from that day from Pesach until the day, because it was scheduled to happen on in a year, right? About 11 months later, another, right? And that's 11 months where you're basically preparing for your annihilation, right? And knowing that you have an option, that you can avoid it by basically relinquishing your Yiddishkeit, and yet the Yidden did not do that, right? They didn't. They stuck with Mordechai, right? They stuck with Mordechai for 11 months. And the Alter Rebbe says that he did not even have a Hirur chutz, not even a consideration, not the slightest consideration of trying to save themselves by denying their right to Yiddishkeit. This is the ultimate Nasa B'Nishma, which is why the Medrash says that this was the completion based on the pasuk in Megillah. This is the culmination, the completion, the moment that the truth has been established, and that is the essence of the Jewish soul. How did this happen? Because Mordechai, who was the Moshe Rabbeinu of his generation, as the Talmud tells us, the Moshe was the one who cultivated that inner essence. As we know, he was the Raya Mehemna. He was the one who cultivated the Emunah. He did not give us Emunah. He just helped the Jew discover his Emunah based on the essence of his soul, right? This was Mordechai as well. What did Mordechai do? Mordechai basically, he appealed to the essence of the Jew. It's interesting because as the story goes, he started first with the children because they're the purest, and then the adults followed the children, and they all rallied behind Mordechai. And this is the real story of Purim, the fact that the essence of their soul came to the fore, okay, in a big way. Okay. So this is, again, going back to what I established at the very beginning of the Shiur, and I said that Purim, basically, according to Hasidus, based on these Chazal, right, has to do with the essence of the Jewish soul, okay? It's the celebration of the essence of the Jewish soul. So let's go back to the halacha of Rabbah. What does it mean? Ad leyoda bin boruch Mordechai la'arer Haman. Says the Alter Rebbe, it means just the opposite. It doesn't say it means the opposite, but when you see it, you realize that it's just the opposite of what appears that people assume. Okay, I would say that today, nowadays, Baruch Hashem, less people think this, right? Because of Baruch Hashem, the messages of Chassidus and the Alter Rebbe have penetrated into other circles as well. Baruch Hashem, the Afatzas Hamayonas Chutza. Okay. I've often said the art scroll, which is, like they published, they were the first ones, that started like a major, operation to publish Svarim in English, right? So one of the very first publications, and this goes way, way back, maybe to the 70s even, certainly, the 80s, at least as far back as the 80s, was the translation of Megillas Esther. And when you take the art scroll, you can still get it today. The art scroll Megillas Esther, it's a thin pamphlet, right? But most of it is actually not the Megillah. Most of it is the preface before, right? And I opened it up and I'm reading it, and it says, this like they're not quoting Chassidus, but it's sounding like Chassidus, because they make reference to the fact that why the Megillah does not mention Hashem even once. And the point is, something that's elaborated in Chassidus is because Purim is a holiday about which we connect to a level from the essence of our existence to a level of godliness that cannot be expressed. It's the essence of Hashem. And being that it's the essence of Hashem, you would be doing you would not be doing justice by referring to Hashem by any kind of name whatsoever, even the name of Yud Kei Vav. Okay, so this will come up a little bit again soon, but like I said, so this is the celebration of Purim. What does it mean? Adel Yoda being Baruch Mordechai and Arur Haman. What does that mean? Says the Alter Rebbe. Says the distinction between Mordechai and Haman is kind of clear. You'll ask anybody, right? And anybody who has any decency whatsoever can immediately see the distinction between someone who represents the good of Mordechai and someone who represents the evil of Haman. It's almost obvious, right? But it's obvious. What is the criteria? On what basis is it obvious? It's based on human experience, right? The human being, the mind, Baruch Hashem, is such where it could actually, maybe not to the total degree, but it can come to some kind of an as objective as possible, to understanding the distinction between good and bad, right? The question though is, what about the Yid, right? That on the surface, there's no Yiddishkeit there. Not only is there no Yiddishkeit, you actually could see on the surface, he's whatever, he's against Yiddishkeit. He's in denial of Yiddishkeit, right? Is he also different? Is there also a distinction between him and anybody else? And the answer is, if it's the essence, then it's the essence. What he's doing on the surface, as much as it might be in conflict with who he really is, right? It cannot change what he truly, in essence, is. This was the point of the story of last week. The guy, the reporter, said something about a Jew who said the most disgusting things, right? And yet the Rebbe said he's a Yid, and you have to be careful how you speak about a Yid, right? I have a important call. So I'm sorry. I don't like doing this, but I need to do it.
You're still on mute. No sound, Rebbe.
Here I am. I'm back. I'm sorry. I saw that I was muted. So what is the Rebbe saying? A Yid is a Yid is a Yid. And even though he may speak and act in a way that isn't, so opposite of what a Yid is, it cannot change that essence. Okay? That, says the Alter Rebbe, is the Pshat Adele Yoda. Nothing changes about Baruch Mordechai or Arur Haman. That is maintained. That stays and that cannot be changed. On Purim, however, we recognize that not based on Yoda, on things that we can identify and understand, but rather Purim is a day when we understand that the distinction could be in total 100% in conflict with what you, with your Yoda, would conclude. Because it's lo Yoda. It's from a level that does not subject itself to human understanding. Why is that Yid different? He sure doesn't look different. He doesn't act different, but he's different because that's the way it is. It's not about Yoda. It's not about being able to explain and describe why. It is completely 100% beyond. Okay? Again, says the Alter Rebbe, when Rabbi said, Adel Yoda bein Arur Haman leBaruch Mordechai, what did Rabbi say? Rabbi said, I want to explain to you what the celebration of Purim is. Lipsumbe, drink wine. Why do you drink wine? Nichnas yayin yotzasoid. Wine goes in, the secret comes out. In this case, says Rabbi, Purim is about revealing the deepest of secrets. a secret which does not lend itself to human understanding. It's beyond yada. The saying l'chaim and drinking on Purim is to help you connect to that level of your inner essence that cannot be explained in regular terms. Yes, Mordechai is Mordechai, Haman is Haman. Yada makes that distinction. On Purim, la yada, that distinction, it will exist even if it's completely counter to your intuition and to your understanding. While ayid is ayid is ayid. And I guess to bring this a little bit to an end, this also explains the name Purim. Okay, so Purim actually means a goyrel, and the mimer that we started learning Shabbos morning last week is a mimer from the Rebbe. Al Kain Kollel Eretz Purim Al Shem Hapur. Purim is the name that was given based on the lottery that Haman had drawn, right? And the question is, like, why do you want to? You take a negative element of the story, and that becomes the name of the Yom Tov, right? And the Rebbe explains that the union of a goyrel, right, has to do, it's an indication of that which is beyond understanding. If you understand why A should be chosen over B, then you choose A over B. You don't have to make a goyrel, right? You choose the one that meets whatever your interests are, right? And you could explain why you made your choice. A goyrel is something that you use when you can't make the choice because it doesn't lend itself to understanding. So that's why Purim is called Purim, because it has to do with this idea of a goyrel. It has to do with something that completely it transcends understanding. The distinction between Haman and Mordechai cannot necessarily be explained as illustrated by the situation of a Yid who's acting in a manner which is like Haman, or Chas v'Shalom, maybe even worse, right? This explains the connection between Purim and the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippurim. Yom Kippur is called Kippur. What is Kippur? Yom Kippurim, it's called. So you have the name Purim in Yom Kippurim. What's Yom Kippur all about? Yom Kippur is the day that we stand before Hashem, right? And we don't argue, we don't try to make a case that Hashem should forgive us because of our virtues. Okay, there might be time for that. And, you might actually succeed in, weighing your virtues against your mistakes, right? And you might come out, looking good, right? We don't even try that on Yom Kippur. The famous speech that I've said many, many times, quoting a friend of mine from Eretz Yisrael, Aviyad Zlatnik was his name. None of you remember him, but we used to give a shiur together. And he once said, I guess it was before Yom Kippur, and he said that he heard from his teacher, and he learned not in a Hasidic yeshiva. It's more like Masad Rav Kook is what it's referred to, associated with the movement of Rav Kook. But in any case, and there are yeshivas today that basically are kind of, they follow that philosophy, that shita. And he said that why on Yom Kippur you come to shul for Kol Nidre. Everybody is in a very solemn and on a serious mood, right? And the first thing you hear is an announcement. We're going to make a special exception because today there's lots of Avaryanim who come to shul because everybody shows up on Yom Kippur. Amongst them, the people who had their Sudah HaMafsekas in McDonald's, Rachmana litzlan, right? So rather than kick them out of shul and say, "What are you doing here?" What do we say? Nope. It's Yom Kippur. We're going to start, before we begin Kol Nidre, making an announcement. Today, we're not making any distinction. What are we coming before Hashem with? that same common denominator that everybody here in Shul shares, regardless of how righteous you are, or regardless of chas v'shalom, the opposite you are. You're a yid, you have a neshama, that neshama is connected to Hashem. That's the highlight of Yom Kippur, and that's why Hashem is going to forgive you. Because you look at Hashem and you say, Hashem, I'm not even going to try. I know I deserve the worst, but you know what, Hashem? We're still connected, we're still bonded. You make that appeal, right? And that explains this announcement that we make before Kol Nidrei. We all dress in white because it's not about, there's no hierarchy. There's no Mizrach Vant on Yom Kippur. We're all here as one, based on that common denominator that unites us, and that is the essence of the Jewish soul. The connection between Yom Kippur and Purim. But let me just end with a thought. And it's kind of like my thought, my own thought in a sense. So there are explanations why Yom Kippur is only Ke Purim. It's like Purim, right? So in the source of this saying, it actually says that Yom Kippur is obviously the holiest day, and Purim is called Purim because it's like Yom Kippurim, right? But in Chassidus, when the Alter Rebbe quotes this, the Alter Rebbe actually turns it upside down. He says, if you look at the word Yom Kippurim, it's Purim is the main thing, and Yom Kippurim is only like Purim, right? So we're comparing Yom Kippur to Purim, opposite of the way it exists in its source. Okay? So the Rebbe has a footnote in this Maimer, and with an attempt to explain how the Alter Rebbe turned it upside down, right? Bottom line, that's what the Alter Rebbe did, right? So I'm going to tell you just my own personal thought, something that came to me in the middle of a Purim Suda a couple of years ago, and I said, okay, both Yom Kippur is the essence of the Jewish soul. Like it says, that's the time when the Yechidah Shebenefesh is the term that's used for the very core essence of our soul, is in its what's it called? It's shining. Yom Kippur, your Yechidah Shebenefesh is what's called is there. You can feel it. It's you have a sense of the Yechidah Shebenefesh. Purim, same thing. Purim is the celebration of the Mesiras Nefesh that the Yidden had, which was what? It was an expression, right, of the essence of their soul, right? But if you look at the two, and they have that common denominator, right, and they both have the Purim element, which has to do with Goyrel, which we explained was something that's beyond what we can understand. It's such an absolute because it just is, right? And then there's another interesting common denominator. The name Yud Kei Vav Kei is not found in the Megillah, like I mentioned before, but it also, when it comes to Yom Kippur, and the Torah describes the whole avodah, the whole service of Yom Kippur, it says, L'fnei Yud Kei Vav Kei Titaru, L'fnei Hashem Titaru. Before Hashem, you shall purify yourself. So Chassidus says, what does L'fnei Hashem mean? That in Yom Kippur, we connect to a level of godliness that's even before Yud Kei Vav Kei. It's even higher than Yud Kei Vav Kei. So we have another common denominator. We're beyond Yud Kei Vav Kei on Yom Kippur, and Yud Kei Vav Kei we don't find it in the Megillah, right? And then we have that they're both called Purim, right? And by the way, this idea of Goyrel was part of the Avodah in Yom Kippur. Because how did they decide which of the two sheep should go? One should go as a carbon, and the other should go to Lazozel to be thrown off the mountain. There had to be two identical, right? And then they would make a Goyrel. Okay, so we have all these common denominators. They're all pointing to the same idea. It's the essence of the soul. And yet, why is Yom Kippur only like Purim? Because if you look carefully, what is the context of where you notice that the main ikuda, the main idea, the theme of Purim is the essence of the Jewish soul? It's what the Jews did. They had Mesiras Nefesh in spite of the absolute darkness, to the point that the Gemara tells us this was the real Na'aseh v'Nishma. Now I know that you're devoted and dedicated absolutely 100%. My technician is here. Let me just open the door for him, and I'll be right back to finish. slept on Zoom class. You want to just go in and do some in the basement? Just kind of what's going on real quick. The washing machine is not washing. Fair enough, but I'll see you when you come down. Yeah, there's the. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. So what was I saying? Oh boy, I'm so sorry about this. So this is the comment. Purim is what the Yidden did. So where do we see the essence of the Jewish soul? The fact that we had Mesiras Nefesh. Things were bleak, things were dark, and yet we went with Mordechai. Mordechai helped us find the essence of our existence. So therefore, regardless of what awaits us, total and complete annihilation, guess what? We're still with Hashem. And they were willing to give up their lives. Yom Kippur is also about the essence. But from whose perspective? From Hashem's perspective. Hashem looks at a Yid and he says, listen, I'm disappointed. You didn't behave like I wanted, but today's Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, I'm going to look beyond all of that, right? And I'm going to see you for who you really are, right? Thank you for showing up in Shul, so I could actually take a look at you, right? But I'm not going to judge you by the fact that you came to Shul. I'm going to judge you by the fact that you're a Yid. You're a Yid, I forgive you. No, so you tell me, what's a bigger news? That the Yidden recognize this, or that Hashem recognizes this? Yom Kippur is Hashem recognizing it. Purim, we're recognizing it, right? So I'll argue that Purim is a greater testimony to this essence of our existence. The fact that we, in the darkest of times, had this Mesiras Nefesh. The fact that in Yom Kippur, the Eibishter recognizes this in us, like, what's the big deal? Of course he sees. There's no darkness for Hashem. There's nothing that's kind of distracting him from this. He just sees it because Hashem is the truth and he sees the truth. So that's why he has a Yom Kippur. It's the day to say, this is how I truly feel about you, right? Therefore, I argue that Purim is the big news and Yom Kippur is like Purim. It's not as big news as Purim. Anyway, so this is my message for you today. This, I think, gives us a whole new perspective on Purim. Purim is great. I love Purim. And it's the Yom Tov that you could thank Chassidus for having given it such an amazing perspective.